Welcome back to the Bar Society podcast. Today, Annie, Emily, and Melina will be joined by Karen Reid. Karen is a graduate of the University of Aberdeen. She will be discussing her journey to the bar after graduating and her work as a human rights barrister. We hope you enjoy.
Good afternoon, Karen. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us.
We have a lot of questions to ask you, so we'll get straight to it. Can you tell us a little about yourself? So when did you attend the University of Aberdeen? What did you study? And what was your route to the bar?
Yeah, so I was at Aberdeen from 2004 until 2008, reading history and international relations. I think my route to the bar kind of started through international relations because we had to do a module in international law, which I really enjoyed and found really interesting. But also I was graduating in 2008 into a recession. Jobs were few and far between, so a lot of us were taking on postgraduate study at that point as well. Law is something that I thought about before I went to university, but changed my mind about, so it had always sort of been floating there. So when my interest was piqued again through the international relations course, I decided that I would look into it a bit more. And so started looking into law and it all went from there.
What did you join and why?
So I joined Middle Temple. At the time, I made that decision because I was very involved in debating when I was at university. And the inn that we kind of saw at debating competitions was Middle Temple. We didn't really see any of the other inns. So it was the only inn that I had any sort of familiarity with. I mean, I went to school in Scotland, obviously I went to university in Scotland, so I hadn't really met any barristers. So that was my kind of only connection to the bar, was that I'd met some Middle Templars at university debating competitions. I mean, I think for most people, that is probably not a good reason to choose your inn of court. So I think what I'd say to people who are, looking at the different inns now is, like, probably if you can go and look round them and get a bit more of a feel for them. Ultimately I would say just join Middle Temple because it's the best inn, but I'm probably supposed to be a little bit more objective than that. But in terms of sort of what the inn can offer, obviously not everyone gets pupillage first time round. And a lot of the inns, the support that they offer to people tends to drop off after they've stopped being students. At Middle Temple, we've had a Young Barristers Association for longer than any other inn. And I think not all the inns even have them at all now. And that supports you from after you've been called to the bar until you're, I think, 7 years post pupillage. So it's a really long time, and it will give you opportunities to do things like mooting, to have your pupillage applications read long after you're a student. And I mean, I think that support is absolutely invaluable. But obviously looking at things like scholarships is a good idea when choosing your inn. And again, the kind of sort of extracurricular things like marshalling, opportunities to get a mentor are very important as well. I think they're all there at Middle Temple, but I think a good reason to join now would be that support that they offer post being a student.
And how long before or after you graduated did you manage to obtain pupillage?
So, well, after graduating university, it was quite a long time, but that's because I had to do a law conversion course. So I did my law conversion course the year after I graduated, and my bar course straight away after that. I didn't get pupillage in my first year of applying, which was when I was on the bar course. I did get it in my second year of applying, but it didn't start for a year after that. So I was called to the bar in 2010, and I started pupillage in 2012. Which is, sorry, a very long-winded way of answering your question.
No, thank you. That was really interesting.
Many people listening today will be interested in becoming a barrister or a solicitor. What made you want to pursue a career at the bar rather than become a solicitor?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question for me, because it was kind of, if I was going to do law, I was going to become a barrister. When I was at school, I'd done work experience with solicitors' firms. I mean, it was fine, but it just hadn't really interested me. I then became quite interested in politics, which is what kind of took me into international relations. And I think the sort of the advocacy and the standing up in court was something that really appealed to me. So for me, sort of graduating from Aberdeen, the decision was more about whether I stayed in Scotland and studied law, or whether I went to England and studied law, which I understand is now a decision I wouldn't have had to have made at Aberdeen, but back then I did have to make it. And I think actually the fact that I wanted to be an advocate and to stand up in court was the reason I chose England, because at the time I would have had to have done, it was a 2-year law conversion in Scotland. Then I would have had to have done, well, the sort of solicitor's training course, and then been a solicitor for probably quite a long time before becoming an unpaid devil to be an advocate. Whereas in England, I could do a 1-year law conversion, a 1-year bar course, and just go straight in, well, you know, subject to getting pupillage, go straight into being a barrister. So that sort of, it was that route that really appealed to me. But at the stage that I was actively choosing to do law, I was also actively choosing not to be a solicitor.
That's really interesting. Where did your interest in human rights stem from, and how did you know that you would decide to go into this field?
Yeah, I mean, we use human rights a lot, and I would say human rights comes into almost every area of law. So I think I was unlikely to ever go into a sort of very commercial or corporate area of law where I was only dealing with businesses. I was always going to go into a sort of more human area of law. And I think at that point, every area of law does concern human rights in one way or another. What I do now, which is mostly immigration and housing work, has largely come about by accident, because I worked for a refugee community organisation after I finished in bar school. Did that because I had an interest in social welfare law, but working with immigrants made me realise that there was actually an area of law around immigration, which we hadn't, because I only did a law conversion course, we only did like core areas of law. So I hadn't really studied public law or immigration law at all. So then I, just working with immigrants, realised that that was quite a high demand area, and went and qualified completely separately under something called the Office of the Immigration Service Commissioner, which is a regulatory body that regulates immigration advisors. So I then was able to actually practice immigration law without having a practicing certificate as a barrister, because I had a different regulator. So I started doing that and just really fell in love with immigration. And then, so when I was applying for pupillages the next time round, I was applying for sort of immigration and family or immigration and crime. And that's sort of how my practice has kind of developed from there.
And what does a typical day at work look like for you then?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do really like about the bar is I think having a typical day at work is quite a difficult thing, because every day is quite different. But the areas of law that I do generally do involve being in court quite a lot. So I'm probably in court 3 or 4 days a week, sometimes 5 days a week. So if I am in court, I'm usually up quite early in the morning to do some work before either going to court or, like today, starting a court hearing from my desk, which is a sort of symptom of the lockdown, really. So most of my hearings are sort of shorter. I do a lot of appeal work rather than trial advocacy. So quite often my cases will only last half a day. They won't necessarily last the first half of the day. So I might spend a lot of the day sitting in a court building, twiddling my thumbs, waiting for my case to be called on. And then I also do quite a lot of drafting work. So drafting judicial review grounds, drafting grounds of appeal, which is what I sort of fill the rest of my day with. And then obviously meeting with clients. So on Monday, one of my clients is actually on remand at the moment. It's not a criminal case, it's a housing case, but obviously this person has other issues as well. So it's currently being held in prison. So I'm actually don't very often go to prison, but on Monday I am going to do a conference in a prison. So sort of interesting experience.
That sounds so interesting, Karen. Thank you. In your opinion, what would you say are some of the benefits and the challenges of her career in human rights?
Yeah, that's quite a big question. I'm going to start with the benefits. I'll start with the positives because it's a bit easier. And really, that's that it's really rewarding. We're actually having, an impact on an individual's life. So asylum cases, for example, it's really life or death if someone gets sent back to a country where they're going to be persecuted. Housing, it's often people who are facing losing their home. So you are having a very real impact on individuals' lives, and that is very rewarding. The challenges, I mostly have to deal with the government. government department make decisions that most of the time make my life more difficult rather than making my life easier. I mean, you only have to open a newspaper to see that we haven't had a government that is pro-immigration for a very long time. So my job becomes harder and harder, not just in terms of the laws that they make around people coming into the country, but also for my clients who are here illegally, laws on how difficult it is for them to obtain housing, for them to access healthcare, for their children to access education. So I do feel that it is a sort of uphill struggle being, I mean, that's specific to immigration law, but for the majority of the sort of the current government, we haven't also not had a very human rights friendly government generally. And I think that's led to a lot of attacks in the media on people who broadly sort of identify themselves as human rights lawyers, which is not a particularly pleasant environment to have to work in either.
Before coming to the bar, you were employed as the head of advocacy and immigration for the Afghan Association Paiwand, a London-based refugee community organisation. How did you come into this role?
I sort of came into that. I was trying to think outside the box a bit. I didn't have pupillage coming out of bar school, so I had to do something to make money, for one thing. But I also, obviously, having not got pupillage, needed to do something that was going to improve my CV. Getting your first paralegal job is incredibly difficult because they are so few and far between, and there are so many people competing for paralegaling roles. I did have a paralegal role in London whilst I was studying the bar course on a very limited, sort of limited weekly hours. But it was so badly paid that I could not have afforded to keep doing it full time after I'd finished the bar course. I needed something that was going to actually allow me to pay rent and bills in London. So I was trying to think outside the box a bit and look for different opportunities that would allow me to use the skills that I'd learned on the bar course, but maybe where I wasn't competing with all the other people who'd come out of bar school without a pupillage. And there still is a website called Charity Jobs, and it advertises charity advocacy jobs. Most of them are actually advocacy, whereby you're sort of advocating for the cause of the charity. But the job that I was doing was actually advocating on behalf of individuals. So it was quite it wasn't directly what I was looking for, but it was actually much better for what I wanted at the time than the roles that I was looking for. So I applied for that, and by some miracle, I think actually managed to get the job because it was an absolutely fantastic job. At the time, I was an advocate. I went in as an advocate, and then I got promoted to head of advocacy. And actually, I set up, because it was a national lottery grant, so I kind of came in at ground level and was setting up the immigration service as well. So yeah.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. What would you say is one of the most beneficial skills one can have as a human rights barrister or as a barrister in general? Yeah, I mean, specifically looking at human rights, I think empathy is really important. It generally, as a barrister, you have to have empathy because you're dealing with individuals. I suppose wider than that is interpersonal skills, because you need to be able to talk to them on their level, and you need to be able to talk to people who are sitting as judges and are professionals, and obviously you need to communicate with them in a very different way to how you would communicate with your lay client, who might be, a very well-off business person, or they might be someone who's escaped trauma in their home country and is really struggling to sort of relive the experience that they've been through and communicate that with you. So yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, interpersonal skills, but particularly with the vulnerable clients that I generally deal with, empathy is probably the most important thing. You've represented a variety of different clients. Do you have a particular type of claim that you find the most interesting? That's quite difficult. I don't know. I mean, one of the things I like about immigration law in particular is the sort of problem solving element of it. So the immigration rules, I don't know if you've ever had cause to look at them, are, I mean, impenetrable. They're appallingly badly drafted, but you're sort of looking at this set of circumstances and trying to fit them to your client's specific facts of your client's case. And I quite enjoy that sort of poring over law and trying to find a solution to the specific problem that my client has.
I do find asylum cases particularly rewarding. I think because the stakes are so high, the difference you're making to someone's life in winning an asylum case is enormous. But equally, I think if all I did was immigration, I think I would go mad, because it can be really frustrating constantly up against the Home Office as your opponent. So I do like having that balance in my practice where I also do housing law. And that's very interesting because, some cases are judicial review and you're dealing with public law challenges. We also have statutory appeals, which again are on public law grounds. Then you have possession cases where you end up going to trial and I get to cross-examine witnesses, which in immigration I never get to cross-examine anyone because it's always appellant advocacy. So I really like having the variety. So to sort of pick one particular type of claim or one particular type of case, I think is quite a difficult thing to do.
Having worked on various human rights issues, from your experience, what areas of human rights do you feel need the most reform, if any?
I think that's an almost impossible question to answer, to pick out, one particular thing. I mean, I think part of the problem is, I don't know if I would say there's a sort of, I'm not going to go to and say like, I think Article 8 is awful, I think Article 3 is awful and needs to be reworded. I think the fundamental rights are there and are identified. I think it's the way in which that's incorporated into the law in the UK and the impact it has. And to pick a sort of current law that is impinging upon people's human rights, that is the worst one at the moment, I honestly, I don't think I could do it. I think there's so many areas that need to be reformed. I think there's obviously a particular threat at the moment that human rights is going to be overhauled completely, which I think will be, very bad. But I think that's a podcast in its own right.
Yes, that's true. I suppose there's so many different things that could come in under that question. You've achieved so much in your career so far. What is something which has surprised you about life at the bar?
I think probably the collegiality. I don't know if that's what you're expecting as an answer to that question, but I certainly find at bar school that it was incredibly competitive, because it's so hard to get pupillage. I mean, when I was at bar school, I think it was 1 in 12 would get pupillage. It's probably worse than that now. And our sort of small tutorial groups were 12 people. So you obviously were not directly, you were directly competing with the people in that room, but you did sort of feel one of us in this room is going to get pupillage, which isn't true because we could have all got pupillage and the people who didn't get it would have been in different rooms. But it was just a very competitive atmosphere. And I thought that was something that might continue into the profession. And obviously it's a very adversarial profession because we're in court and we're arguing against each other. But at the same time, it is a really collegiate profession, and people genuinely, I can go into court and I can argue with them and be completely disagreeing with them and saying to the judge that they're wrong, and that there's no base to their arguments whatsoever, and that they've misapplied the case law and completely misunderstood my client's circumstances. And then I can go out for dinner with them 2 nights later, and we get on perfectly well. So I think that aspect of it was the most surprising thing for me.
That's good to know, Karen. Having worked so hard throughout your career, what would you say is one of the most rewarding aspects about your job?
The most rewarding aspect, I mean, I've kind of talked about how rewarding it is as a career quite a lot already. I mean, winning cases is definitely the sort of most rewarding aspect. But I think quite often we don't get decisions straight away. We get them in writing, weeks later, and you don't actually get to see the client's reaction. So I think the cases where we get the decision there and then on the spot, and it is a good decision, and you get to see your client's reaction to that decision, I think is the most rewarding aspect of the career.
I can only imagine how amazing that must feel. Karen, do you have any tips or advice for a mini pupillage and pupillage applications and interviews in general?
Yeah, so the process for mini pupillages and pupillages are quite separate. So in terms of mini pupillage, every chambers will have a different policy for how you can get a mini pupillage. So, look into that. So my chambers, for example, we run 2 advocacy competitions, a written and oral advocacy competition. And that is almost the only way you can get a mini pupillage at Chambers. But we do also support the Temple, Inner and Middle Temple have an access to the bar scheme for people who are coming to the bar from non-traditional backgrounds, and we do take mini pupils through that as well. And then we also work with an organisation called Bridging the Bar, and we take mini pupils through them. And possibly another couple of similar schemes as well. But it's all sort of merit focused in order to get a mini pupillage. Yeah, look into the individual chambers and target your application in that way. The other thing I'd say about mini pupillages is don't do too many. You know, if you're applying to chambers outside of London, then for pupillage, I mean, make sure you've done a mini pupillage in that geographical area. Do a mini pupillage in the area of law that you're particularly interested in. But having like 6 mini pupillages on your CV is, in my opinion, and you may hear other opinions from other people, a waste of time. You're much better, do a couple of mini pupillages and spend those other 3 weeks marshalling with a judge or entering, legal essay competitions, doing an advocacy competition, doing a mooting competition or something like that, because it's much better to have variety, but also to show your own skills. Whereas in a mini pupillage, you're literally following someone around. So, it shows you have an understanding of the profession, but it doesn't actually show that you necessarily have the skills it takes to become a barrister. So, yeah, I mean, my tip for mini pupillage applications, I think, is understand how that Chambers approaches mini pupillages. There's no point in sending just a general letter asking for a mini pupillage with your CV if they have a specific process. Some chambers will just accept CVs and covering letters, so that's worth doing, but you need to know that that's their process. In terms of pupillages, again, do your research. Through they keep changing the name of the pupillage application portal. It was called Pupillage Gateway. I can't even remember what it's now called. But you only get 12 applications. So you do have to think about why you're applying to the chambers that you're applying to. So try and meet people from different chambers, whether that's when they put on like virtual open days or when you go to an inn of court and you go to dinner, try and meet different barristers from that set of chambers to understand the sort of ethos of the chambers and the atmosphere within chambers, and try and learn things about that chambers that are not written on their website, because that will give you something to put in your application that no one else is going to have in their application. But also research what the chambers is looking for. Good sets of chambers now publish their very specific criteria of what they're looking for in pupillage, how they're assessing that at each stage of the process on their website. So look at that so you know what you're trying to show them when you fill in your application form, and you know what you're trying to show them when you're answering questions during interview. So that kind of partly covers, because I think you asked about pupillage interviews as well. I mean, interviews, again, you could have an entire podcast on pupillage interviews. Practice, like just get people to run mock interviews for you. All the Inns of Court offer mock interview schemes, so definitely get a mock interview that way. If you have a mentor, get them to give you a mock interview. Your law school careers service should be able to give you mock interviews. Get your friends to just ask you questions that come up in pupillage interviews. Keep records when you do have interviews of what questions get asked. Ask them to your friends, get your friends to ask them to you, so that the first time you're answering that question is probably not during an interview. So it's important to still come across as spontaneous, but yeah, just practice as much as you possibly can.
Thank you so much for that advice. It's definitely very useful. If you could give one piece of advice to students wanting to pursue a career at the bar, what would you say?
This sounds awful, but get used to failure. It is tough. Like, getting pupillage is not easy. I don't want to make it sound rosy. I mean, I said when I did it, it was 1 in 12 people. It's definitely worse than that now. You are going to get rejections. And most people applying for pupillage are not used to rejection because they've done very well throughout their academic careers. And the first time that you get someone comes back to you and says, we're not even going to interview you for pupillage, is very hard to deal with. But you just have to learn to bounce back from that. I mean, the first year I applied for pupillage, I didn't get a single interview. And you just have to learn to sort of channel that rejection, go back, analyze your applications, think about what went wrong, and come back fighting the next time around. And so I think, unfortunately, it sounds really awful, but get used to failure is my top tip.
And just a follow-up question on that. How did you sort of deal with the rejection? What did you do?
I'm not even sure I know the answer to that. I think it helps to have friends who are going through the same thing at the same time. So sort of just having people you can vent to and reminding yourself that, you know, this is something you want, but also having a plan B. I think when I was applying, when I was at Paiwand, if I didn't get pupillage and I'd stayed and I'd worked in charity advocacy for the rest of my career, that would have been a fantastic career and I would have loved it. So I think knowing that you're not just sitting in a job that is adding some CV points for the bar, but is not really going to get you anywhere in the rest of your career, I think is good, because then if you fail, it's not actually a complete failure. It's, you know, I failed at that door, but I've already opened another door and I'm on a path that I'm happy with. So I think, and celebrate the wins.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be part of our podcast today.
That's quite all right.
Thank you for listening. Please follow us on Instagram at barsocabdn and on Facebook at Bar Society Aberdeen to stay up to date on upcoming episodes of our podcast.